Did you know that Adam almost had another wife before Eve, or that there were other humans before the first humans? And those aren't the only reasons why the Bible's creation story is so controversial. Though it may seem pretty unique at first glance, the story of Adam and Eve actually isn't particularly original. For example, the creation story of the Mesopotamians, known as the Enuma Elish, shares some notable similarities. In both cases, the world is created out of darkness and chaos, and humans are made to recognize and maintain the glory of the world created by the gods. Historian Stephen Greenblatt suspects that exiled Jews living in the region were taking their cues directly from this origin tale. It gets even more complicated when you dig deeper. Just as God creates Adam from clay, so does the ancient Egyptian god Khnum create humans on a potter's wheel, and the Chinese goddess Nugua crafted people from riverbed clay. Then there's a certain Greek myth in which the semi-divine Prometheus tricks the chief god Zeus by stealing fire and giving it to humans. For his rebellion, Prometheus is tied to a rock and an eagle eats from his liver eternally. In some versions of the tale, there's even a woman created from clay named Pandora, who opens a box after explicitly being told not to do so, and thereby releases all evil into the world.
Evil!
Careful readers of Genesis will notice something very odd, as there are actually two creation stories. Chapter 1 outlines God's creation of everything, and then Genesis 2 details what seems like a different version, with Adam coming first, followed by plants and animals, and then Eve. Biblical scholars generally agree that these accounts were written by two different authors with distinct theological takes. That can be troubling for believers, especially those who attempt to reconcile modern science with the ancient account. In some interpretations, it implies that there was another human woman who's created before Eve. In certain traditions, she's named Lilith. The medieval text known as the Alphabet of Ben Sira contends that she wouldn't submit to Adam, arguing that they were both made from the same material at the same time and thus were equals. Their argument became so intense that Lilith fled Adam and became a demonic figure that would eventually stalk defenseless babies. Similar demons known as Liliths are also referenced in Jewish sources from the Babylonian exile and early Islamic tradition. The Bible only mentions her once in the book of Isaiah, where some translations refer to a demon as a Lilith, while the King James translation refers to this figure as a screech owl. If Adam and Eve really were the first humans, then their children's only options for mates would have been their siblings, which raises some red flags when it comes to biology. Today, we know that the children of closely related couples are at higher risk of inheriting certain genetic disorders, especially if both parents carry a copy of a recessive gene. This is also a problem morally. Later passages in the Bible explicitly state that incest is forbidden, though Adam and Eve's son Cain essentially gets a pass because there were no other options for him. Furthermore, Adam and Eve would have been perfectly created by God and free of genetic defects, so some interpretations contend that their children would have been as well. Scientists have traced the human lineage back to a so-called genetic Adam and Eve who contributed genetic material to nearly all humans alive today. However, there's no evidence that they were the only man and woman around at the time, just that their genes happened to pass on through the many generations that followed them.
Scientists in the U.S. and Switzerland have announced an amazing revelation that supports the biblical story of Adam and Eve.
Attempts to skirt the implied incest of Adam and Eve's family have led to another contentious theory. According to some interpretations, it's possible that other humans were around before Adam and Eve. Though this isn't mentioned in the Bible, it would take at least some of the pressure off the possibility that Cain and his siblings were all marrying each other. But this idea, called the Pre-Adamite theory, has issues of its own. People began considering this theory around the time that European explorers began making contact with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. It was seemingly impossible that these people shared a common pair of ancestors with Europeans. Thus, there might have been another Adam and Eve, though this threatened the Genesis story to its very core. In a far more chilling development, others concluded that these people may have existed before Adam and Eve, but lacked souls and were therefore more animal than human. Considering all this, the pre-Adamite theory is undeniably linked to racism. For example, in Australia, it was used to paint the Aboriginal people as subhuman brutes and led to the implementation of policies that stripped them of their fundamental rights. Though there's some confusion about the differences between the first two chapters of Genesis, the story told in Genesis 3 is fairly straightforward. Adam and Eve are content in the Garden of Eden, but then a serpent appears and tempts Eve to eat from the one tree God has explicitly told them to avoid. Both she and Adam consume the tree's fruit, and then they realize that they're naked. They cover themselves, but they're caught by God anyway, and then they're expelled from the garden to face a lifetime of suffering. For many, the moral of the story is pretty obvious: don't disobey God. But for others, that only skims the surface. It could be a story about humanity realizing its own mortality, or it could be an allegory about the knowledge of human sexuality. Other theories veer even further afield, with one arguing that this may be linked to psychedelics, which could open people's minds to new knowledge.
Wow. You just wrinkled my brain, man.
Though both Adam and Eve are saddled with the consequences of their disobedience, it's hard to deny that Eve has been blamed more often over the centuries. She's essentially been pinned as the source of all of mankind's woes. But that's odd when you consider that she was subordinate to Adam and subject to his leadership. The story of Adam and Eve has been used to both vilify women, who are seen in some Christian contexts as inheritors of Eve's sin, as well as to justify their continued subservience not just to their husbands, but to all men. Though this has been a prevailing notion for ages, it's by no means universally accepted by all believers. As noted by the Society of Biblical Literature, translations may have missed the subtleties of older Hebrew texts of Genesis, which might imply that Adam had as much culpability as Eve. As the historian Stephen Greenblatt notes, the misogyny isn't necessarily in the original text. Instead, it has more to do with St. Augustine of Hippo, an early figure in the Christian church who was one of the first to pin Eve with the supposed crime. According to Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, God tells a post-rebellion Eve that she will now endure painful childbirth, the implication that all women are doomed to the same fate. Eventually, people began to assume that the pain of birth was simply the due of all women thanks to their female ancestor. Martin Luther even wrote that the agony of childbearing brought women closer to God. But an earlier incident in Genesis provides a rebuttal to this interpretation. When Scottish obstetrician James Simpson discovered in the 19th century that chloroform could dull the pain of birth, some religious authorities reacted strongly. They called Simpson's findings satanic and even threatened to deny baptism to children whose mothers opted for anesthesia. Simpson argued in turn that Adam had been put to sleep by God for the operation of turning a rib into a wife. So if Adam and modern man could be given pain relief, why should it be denied to women? The presence of the tree of knowledge presents a serious moral quandary that has led to plenty of theological arguments. The issue tends to be specifically about the knowledge of good and evil. What exactly constitutes good and evil, though, varies from theologian to theologian. But common interpretations hold that eating the tree's fruit can give someone wisdom, sexuality, omniscience, or even a sense of morality. Though the text of Genesis itself can be vague, it's clear that Adam and Eve gained some sort of understanding that fundamentally changed how they saw themselves and the rest of the world.
This changes everything!
But what about before they bit into the tree's bounty? How could Adam and Eve have known that what they were doing was wrong beforehand? One theory says that they had a technical knowledge of good and evil. They knew that their existence in Eden was good and that God had forbidden eating from that one tree, though they might not have fully understood the depth of their rebellion until after the sin was committed. Depending on which particular church you may visit, original sin may or may not exist. Whether or not it does is kind of a big deal, as some religious rituals, like infant baptism, hinge on the entire concept. It centers around the idea that we are all born with a desire to do evil and act against God's will, thanks to the original disobedience of Adam and Eve. It's important to note, though, this concept doesn't come straight from the Bible, though St. Paul might have been referring to it when he wrote in his letter to the Romans that Adam brought sin and death into existence. The idea of original sin only really gained traction when St. Augustine started writing about it in the 4th and 5th centuries, and it was only officially accepted in the Catholic Church in the 16th century. There's a pretty clear villain in the Garden of Eden in the form of a serpent. Although both Adam and Eve are held responsible for their actions, they are not the only ones who face divine punishment, as the serpent is cursed by God to crawl around on its belly and eat dust for the rest of existence. Considering its place at the heart of the fall of humanity, the identity of the serpent must be obvious. It's Satan, of course, except that's not so clear. In the biblical text, the serpent is never identified in that way. In fact, the ancient Hebrews didn't recognize a chief evildoer at all, much less one named Satan. It didn't even happen in the Christian New Testament. Instead, the identification of this mysterious serpent as Satan is a later cultural invention. That hasn't stopped modern believers from making this connection, though. For example, the website Answers in Genesis, which is connected to young earth creationism and led by Christian fundamentalist Kent Ham, argues that the serpent could still have been influenced by an unseen and unmentioned Satan.
Could it be Satan?
Ultimately, we can probably agree that the Adam and Eve story is a sad one. The pair are cast out of a paradise on earth and must now live a life full of toil and pain. There can't possibly be an upside to this grim conclusion, but there might actually be another way of looking at it. According to some interpretations, it could be that the fall, as awful as it may have been in the moment and for quite a few generations after, was ultimately a net good for humanity. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for example, teaches that the fall was necessary for humans to experience life in all of its complexity, including the joy of redemption. And Mormons aren't alone in this view. Early Christian thinkers like St. Ambrose and Thomas Aquinas also believed that the fall was necessary to achieve a greater and more lasting moral good. This concept of a fortunate fall actually has a name in Latin, Felix culpa. This phrase is part of a 4th century Catholic hymn that is still sung today. Even so, other writers and thinkers like John Milton, author of the 17th century epic poem Paradise Lost, persist in the belief that it would have been better if Adam and Eve had followed instructions and remained in Eden.